The rich man is going to sacrifice his 4-year-old daughter's horse, but the horse realizes and does something. Comment what you think will happen. Your opinion is very important, and subscribe to my channel to support my work. Your help is very important. The biting wind of early morning sliced through the air of Harmony Creek like a sharp knife, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine that characterized this forgotten corner of rural Georgia. Walter Montgomery stood motionless on the wooden porch of his simple house, his eyes fixed on the pasture where his daughter, Carrie, slept soundly in her bedroom. At 52, this man with broad shoulders and a face hardened by worry carried a burden that no one in town imagined. His trembling hands held a mug of lukewarm coffee as he mentally calculated, for the 100th time this week, how much time he had before the creditors came to collect what he owed. The small furniture workshop he had inherited from his father had been on the verge of bankruptcy for months. The backroom poker games at the local bar had consumed everything he had managed to save over decades of hard work. Now, all that remained were overdue bills, the whispered threats from the guys in cheap suits who appeared at his door, and a 4-year-old daughter who had no idea of the financial abyss they were in. Carrie woke up when the first rays of sun began to filter through the cracks in the wooden window frame. Her brown hair was tousled against the faded fabric pillow, and her dark eyes still carried traces of tears she had shed before falling asleep. It had been 3 months since her mother had passed away, a victim of pneumonia that the town doctors couldn't cure. And since then, the little girl's nights had been filled with nightmares and a loneliness that seemed bigger than her small body. She jumped out of bed with the typical energy of a 4-year-old, running barefoot across the cold floor of the house until she reached the back door. Her little feet knew every loose board, every uneven spot on the wooden floor that creaked under her weight. Walter watched her from the kitchen window, noting how his daughter's eyes sparkled with genuine joy for the first time in weeks as she spotted the white figure in the pasture. The horse raised his majestic head at the sound of Carrie's hurried footsteps. He was an imposing animal with fur as white as cotton and a mane that rippled gently in the morning breeze. His dark brown eyes showed a peculiar intelligence, as if he could see beyond what other animals perceived. At 8 years old, this horse had arrived on the property 2 years earlier, brought by a cattle dealer who needed to settle a debt with Walter. From day one, he had established an inexplicable connection with Carrie. The girl ran to the wooden fence that bordered the small pasture, extending her small hands to caress the animal's soft muzzle. The horse lowered his head, allowing her to run her fingers through his silky mane, a ritual that had been repeated every morning since her mother's passing. It was the only time of day when Carrie truly smiled, when she felt the animal's warm breath against her face and heard the deep sound of his gentle neigh. "Good morning, Snowball," she whispered, using the affectionate nickname she had given the horse. "I dreamed about Mommy again. She was in a very beautiful place, full of yellow flowers like the ones that grow near the creek." The horse remained still, as if understanding every word. His ears moved slightly, capturing not only the sound of the child's voice, but also the nuances of sadness she carried. There was something in the air that morning that made him restless, a premonition that his animal nature could detect more clearly than any human. Walter watched the scene from the window, feeling a tightness in his chest that he had been trying to ignore for weeks. The connection between his daughter and that animal was undeniable, but it also represented the solution to his most pressing problems. A dealer from a neighboring county had offered him a considerable amount for the horse, enough money to pay off at least the most dangerous debts. The animal's fate was not something he wanted to think about, but he knew that desperate. Men like the buyer rarely had good intentions. Carrie spent the entire morning playing near the pasture, creating imaginary games where she and the horse were the protagonists of fantastic adventures. She made small crowns of wildflowers and placed them on the animal's head, who remained patiently still while she chatted about dreams, fears, and memories of her mother. The horse responded with gentle movements of his head, as if actively participating in the conversation. During lunch, Walter barely managed to swallow the simple food he had prepared. Carrie ate in silence, occasionally looking out the window to make sure her friend was still there. The afternoon passed slowly, with the girl helping her father, with small household chores, but always returning to the pasture to check on the horse. As the sun began to set, painting the sky orange and purple, Carrie said goodbye to the animal with more affection than usual, as if something in her childish heart sensed that this might be the last time. The horse watched her walk back to the house, his eyes following every movement of the girl until she disappeared through the back door. Night fell heavily on Harmony Creek, bringing with it an unsettling silence. Walter waited until he was sure that Carrie was sound asleep before leaving through the front door, carrying a thick rope and a flashlight. The horse sensed his approach long before he saw him, beginning to show signs of agitation that Walter tried to ignore. When he managed to place the rope around the animal's neck, their eyes met for an instant, and Walter swore he saw an expression of betrayal that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The buyer's truck was parked on the dirt road, with the engine running and the lights off. Walter handed over the animal without looking back, pocketing the money with hands that trembled more from guilt than from cold. When he returned home, he found Carrie still sleeping, oblivious to the fact that her only source of joy had disappeared forever. Carrie's scream tore through the silence of the morning like a dagger piercing the heart of anyone who heard it. Walter woke up startled in his chair in the kitchen, where he had spent the night trying to find the courage to face what he would do when his daughter discovered what had happened. The sound coming from the backyard was one of pure despair, a mixture of crying and desperate calls that made his stomach churn with guilt. Carrie had run to the pasture as she did every morning, carrying a small apple that she had saved from the previous dinner as a gift for her friend. Her bare feet stumbled on the grass wet with dew when she realized that the pasture was empty. The wooden fence remained intact, but there was no sign of the white horse that always waited for her. In that same spot, she dropped the apple on the ground as her eyes frantically scanned every corner of the field, looking for any trace of her companion. "Snowball! Snowball! Where are you?" she cried, her childish voice echoing through the silent property. She began to run along the perimeter of the fence, examining every crack, every loose board, imagining that maybe he had found a way to escape during the night. Her little hands clung to the rough wood as tears began to stream down her rosy cheeks. Walter appeared at the back door, his face pale, and his eyes avoiding his daughter's desperate gaze. He tried to look surprised, frowning as if he was also confused by the animal's disappearance. "Carrie, what happened? Why are you screaming like that?" The girl ran to him, clinging to his legs with a strength that seemed disproportionate to her small size. "Daddy, Snowball is gone. He's not in the pasture. Have you seen him? He may have been hurt. He may need help." The words tumbled out between sobs, and Walter felt his heart break as he saw the genuine despair in his daughter's eyes. "Maybe he broke the fence during the night," he lied, hating himself for every word that came out of his mouth. "Horses are smart animals. Sometimes they can find ways to get out. Maybe he'll come back on his own later." Carrie stared at him with such pure hope that Walter had to look away. "Do you really think so, Daddy? He always comes home when he goes out to graze. He would never stay away from me without a very important reason." Her voice was filled with a childish conviction that only made the situation more painful. The next few hours were agonizing for both of them. Carrie refused to go inside, remaining seated in the empty pasture, hoping that her friend would appear at any moment. She didn't touch her breakfast or lunch, keeping her eyes fixed on the horizon where the dirt road disappeared among the trees. Walter tried to convince her to eat, but each attempt was met with a silent refusal and a look that mixed hope and despair. Meanwhile, many miles away, the white horse fought for his freedom inside a noisy truck that followed bumpy roads towards a town he had never known. His hooves slipped on the metal floor with every sharp turn, and his eyes showed an agitation that went far beyond the natural fear of an animal in captivity. There was something deeper in his behavior, a restlessness that seemed connected to the memory of the girl he had left behind. The dealer who had bought the animal was a corpulent middle-aged man, with calloused hands and eyes that showed years of business where compassion was seen as weakness. He drove the truck with the skill of someone who had transported hundreds of animals, completely ignoring the sounds of anguish coming from the truck bed. For him, this was just another lucrative deal, a transaction that would turn a beautiful horse into quick money. The final destination of the trip was a slaughterhouse on the outskirts of a neighboring county, a place where questions about the origin of the animals were rarely asked. The horse, even without fully understanding what awaited him, felt an imminent danger that made his instincts scream for escape. His attempts to escape intensified when the truck slowed down to enter a secondary road. It was during a particularly sharp turn that the horse managed to knock down the rear latch of the truck with a series of desperate kicks. The door opened with a metallic crash, and he jumped out of the moving vehicle, rolling down the asphalt. Rode in a maneuver that could have been fatal. The dealer braked sharply, but when he got out to look for the animal, he found only traces of blood that were lost in the dense forest. The horse had managed to get up despite the injuries to his hooves and front legs. His white coat was stained with blood and dirt, but his eyes still shone with a determination that transcended his animal nature. Without hesitation, he began to walk in the opposite direction from which the truck was going, guided by an instinct that pulled him back home, back to the girl who needed him. Back in Harmony Creek, Carrie had spent the entire day in the pasture, creating increasingly elaborate theories about where her friend might be. She talked to herself, as if the horse was still present, telling him about the birds she had seen, about the clouds that passed in the sky, about how her stomach hurt from missing her mother so much, and now him too. As the sun began to set, Walter finally managed to convince his daughter to go inside, promising that they would look for the horse the next day. Carrie ate only a few spoonfuls of soup, her eyes red from crying so much. She lay down in bed still, dressed, hugging a small rag doll that her mother had made, whispering childish prayers asking for her friend to return safe and sound. Walter stayed up late, counting and recounting the money he had received from the sale of the animal. The amount was considerable, enough to solve some of his most urgent problems, but each bill seemed to weigh like lead in his hands. His daughter's cries of despair echoed in his mind, mingling with the memory of the horse's look of betrayal at the moment of farewell. During the early morning hours, Carrie woke up from a nightmare where she saw her friend trapped in a dark and scary place, calling for her. She got up silently and walked to the window that overlooked the pasture, hoping against all logic that maybe he had returned while she slept. The pasture remained empty, bathed in the pale light of the full moon that made the tears on her face shine like small diamonds. It was then that she made a decision that would change everything. If her father couldn't find the horse, she would go out to look for him herself. Carrie put on her warmest coat and put on her shoes, determined not to return home without her best friend by her side. The wooden door creaked softly when Carrie opened it carefully, her small fingers trembling as much from cold as from fear. The early morning was especially cold, and the wind carried the damp smell of the forest that stretched beyond her father's property. She had waited until she was sure that Walter was sound asleep before executing her desperate plan to find the horse she considered her only true family in the world. Her steps were cautious on the dirt floor of the yard, avoiding the loose stones that could make noise and wake her father. Carrie carried a small pink school backpack, where she had put a half-empty water bottle, 2 cookies left over from dinner, and a drawing she had made of the white horse the previous week. In her childish mind, the plan was simple. She would follow the main road until she found some trace of her friend, ask the people she met along the way, and return home with him before the sun rose completely. Reality proved to be much more cruel and complex than her 4-year-old imagination could anticipate. The dirt road that led to the county was much longer than it seemed when traveled in her father's truck. And in the darkness of early morning, every shadow turned into something threatening. Carrie walked for almost 2 hours, her little feet beginning to ache inside the shoes that were already too tight, before she realized that she had taken a completely wrong turn. What she thought was the main road was actually a side trail used by locals to reach a denser wooded area where some still kept small patches of corn and beans. The trees closed over her head like a dark green ceiling, almost completely blocking the moonlight that had guided her there. The sound of her own footsteps seemed amplified in the stillness of the forest, mixed with the night sounds that she had never heard so closely. Meanwhile, many miles away, the white horse continued his journey back home, dragging himself painfully through the thick vegetation that lined the back roads. His wounds had stopped bleeding, but the pain in his hooves forced him to stop frequently, to rest. His coat, once immaculate, was now covered in mud, dry leaves, and small scratches caused by the branches he encountered along the way. The animal seemed guided by something stronger than his own survival instinct. With each mile traveled, his determination only intensified, as if he could sense that Carrie needed him in a way that went beyond simple companionship. His brown eyes shone with an almost human clarity as he carefully chose each step, avoiding the main roads where he could be recaptured. Back in the woods where Carrie was lost, the girl began to feel the first signs of panic. The trails multiplied in several directions, and she could no longer remember which way she had come. She tried to shout the horse's name, but her childish voice was lost among the tall trees, returning only as a distorted echo that frightened her even more. Tears began to stream down her face as she spun in circles, looking for any familiar sign. Hunger and thirst began to manifest when the sun finally appeared between the treetops, bringing a little warmth and light to the forest. Carrie had drunk all the water from her bottle and eaten the cookies in the first hour of walking, when she believed she would soon find her way back. Now, with an empty stomach and a dry mouth, she began to understand the gravity of her situation. Walter woke up around 7 in the morning, as he always did, and it took him a few minutes to realize that the house was too quiet. Carrie was usually the first to wake up, running immediately to the yard to check if the horse had returned during the night. When he went to his daughter's room and found the bed empty, with the covers still warm but messy, a chill ran down his spine. He ran through the house shouting Carrie's name, checking every room, every hiding place where she might be playing. It was only when he found the back door ajar that he understood what had happened. His 4-year-old daughter had left alone during the early morning hours, probably looking for the horse he had sold so cowardly. The guilt he had been carrying since the night before turned into pure despair. Walter put on the first clothes he found and ran out of the property, shouting his daughter's name in all directions. He searched the nearby fields, the small woods that bordered the neighbor's land, the main road that led to town. His screams echoed through the rural landscape, but received no response. It was when he found small footprints in the soft earth near the gate that he understood that Carrie had really left the property during the night. In the woods, Carrie had found a small stream where she managed to drink some water, but the intense thirst made her feel dizzy in a way she had never experienced before. She tried to follow the course of the stream, vaguely remembering hearing adults comment that water always led back home, but the path became increasingly steep and dangerous. Her small legs trembled with fatigue, and her eyes burned from crying. So much It was during the afternoon, when the sun was strongest and the heat became unbearable even under the shade of the trees, that Carrie finally collapsed. Her knees buckled, and she fell seated in a small clearing, surrounded by thorny bushes that scratched her delicate skin. The fatigue was so intense that she could barely keep her eyes open, and a fever began to manifest, making her alternate between chills and hot flashes. The white horse, at that same moment, had managed to reach a road that he vaguely recognized. His instincts guided him in the right direction, but exhaustion began to take its toll. He also had not eaten or drunk properly since his escape, and his wounds throbbed with every step. Even so, something inside him prevented him from stopping, an inexplicable certainty that he needed to continue, that someone very important was waiting for him. When night fell again, Carrie was delirious with fever, talking to herself with people who were not there, calling for her mother and the white horse in a confused mixture of memories and hallucinations. She had curled up against the trunk of a large tree, trying to protect herself from the cold that returned with the darkness, but her small body trembled uncontrollably. Walter had organized an impromptu search party with some neighbors, including Beverly, a 68-year-old woman who lived on the property next door and who had always shown special affection for Carrie. The men carried flashlights and walked the back roads, shouting the girl's name and hoping against all hope to hear her voice responding from somewhere in the darkness. What none of them knew was that the white horse was getting closer and closer, following a trail that would lead him directly to the area where Carrie was lost. His steps were slow but determined, and something in his movements suggested that he knew exactly where he needed to get to, even if he couldn't explain how or why. The third day in the woods was when Carrie stopped being able to get up. Her small figure was curled up against the protruding roots of a century-old tree, her lips cracked and her skin as pale as paper. The fever had intensified during the night, making her alternate between moments of confused consciousness and periods where she called for her mother in an increasingly weak voice. Her eyes, which once shone with the typical liveliness of a 4-year-old, were now blurred and unfocused. Thirst was a constant torture. She had tried to chew some leaves that she had seen birds eating, but the bitter taste had made her vomit what little was left in her empty stomach. The stream she had found on the first day seemed to be miles away, although in reality it was only a few hundred yards away. Carrie no longer had the strength to look for it, and her childish mind began to accept that she might never see her father or her beloved horse again. It was the sound of hooves stepping on dry leaves that made her open her eyes for the first time in hours. At first, she thought it was just another hallucination caused by the fever, like the many she had had during the night. But the sound was approaching, slow and careful, accompanied by a heavy breathing that she would recognize anywhere in the world. When she managed to focus her eyes in the direction of the noise, her heart almost stopped beating. The white horse was standing a few feet away, watching her with those brown eyes that showed an almost human concern. His coat was no longer the immaculate white that she remembered. It was dirty with mud and blood, with visible wounds on his hooves and small cuts scattered across his body. He looked as exhausted as she did, but there was something in his posture that conveyed strength and determination. "Snowball," Carrie whispered, her hoarse voice barely able to form the word. For a moment, she doubted her own sanity, wondering if the fever wasn't creating cruel visions of hope where there was none. But then the horse approached slowly, lowered his head, and gently touched the girl's face with his soft muzzle. And she knew it was real. The tears that streamed down her face were different from the ones she had shed in recent days. They were tears of pure relief, of a joy so intense that it seemed impossible to fit in her small, weakened body. She reached out her trembling hands to caress the animal's neck, feeling the warmth of his skin and the familiar texture of his tangled mane. The horse seemed to perfectly understand the critical state in which Carrie found herself. He lay down beside her carefully, positioning his body to offer warmth and protection from the cold wind that began to blow more intensely. His breathing was heavy, indicating that he was also at the limit of his strength, but his eyes remained alert, watching the surroundings like a dedicated guardian. During the following hours, a silent routine was established between them. The horse got up periodically to look for water sources nearby, always returning with a wet muzzle that he offered to the girl, allowing her to lick the precious drops that accumulated on his lips. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep her hydrated enough to remain conscious. Carrie discovered that she could lean on the horse to move small distances. Together, they managed to reach a small natural cave formed by overlapping rocks, a shelter that offered protection from both the rain that threatened to fall and the wild animals that occasionally passed through the area. The horse, carefully, investigated every corner of the space before allowing Carrie to settle there, demonstrating a protective instinct that went far beyond the normal behavior of his species. Meanwhile, the searches organized by Walter intensified with each passing day. Beverly had become a central figure in the operation, using her decades of experience living in that area to suggest places where a lost child might have taken refuge. Her house had become the improvised command center where neighbors gathered to plan search routes and share any information that might be useful. "That girl is smart," Beverly said to the other participants in the search, trying to keep spirits high. "She knows these woods better than many grown-ups. If she can find shelter and water, she can survive until we find her." But in her eyes there was a growing concern that she was trying to hide from Walter, who was already showing clear signs of despair after 3 days without news of his daughter. What none of them knew was that Carrie and the horse were developing a form of communication that transcended the barriers between species. The animal could interpret the smallest gestures of the girl, understanding when she needed water, when she felt cold, or when the pain became unbearable. In return, Carrie had learned to read the horse's signs, recognizing when he detected danger nearby or when he found something that could be useful for her survival. It was on the 4th night that the situation became truly critical. Carrie's fever had increased dangerously, and she began to have seizures that frightened the horse. The animal had never witnessed anything like this, but his instinct guided him to an action that would save the girl's life. He left the cave in complete darkness, desperately looking for one of the search parties he had heard passing nearby during the day. The horse traveled almost 2 kilometers before finding a trail with recent human footprints. He followed the trail until he reached a secondary road, where he began to neigh loudly and repeatedly, a sound that echoed through the silent forest. It was completely atypical behavior for a horse in a vulnerable situation, but he seemed to understand that it was the only way to attract human attention to the place where Carrie was dying. Beverly was the first to hear the neighs. She was returning from one of the nightly searches when the sound reached her ears, coming from a direction that had not yet been fully explored. Something in the tone of those animal cries made her stop and pay attention, because they did not seem to express fear or pain, but urgency, as if the animal was trying to communicate something specific. "Walter!" she shouted to the man who was walking a few feet behind. "Are you hearing this? There's a lost horse out there in the woods, and from the sound of it, he's trying to call us for something." Walter ran in the direction indicated by Beverly, his flashlight cutting through the darkness as he followed the sound of the neighs. When he finally managed to spot the animal, his heart stopped for a moment. It was the white horse he had sold, the same one his daughter adored, but he was visibly injured and in deplorable condition. What shocked him most, however, was the animal's behavior. He did not run away when he saw the humans approaching, but instead began to walk slowly in the opposite direction, stopping frequently to look back, as if he wanted them to follow him. "That horse knows where Carrie is," Beverly whispered, her voice filled with a certainty that came from decades of observing the behavior of the animals in the area. He came to get help for her. The path to the cave where Carrie was sheltered seemed eternal to Walter. Each step was a mixture of desperate hope and terror of what he might find. The white horse guided them with a precision that defied any logical explanation, stopping only to make sure that the humans were still following him. Beverly carried a first aid kit that she always took during the searches, while other neighbors joined the group after hearing the shouts of discovery. When they finally reached the rocky opening, the scene they found made Walter fall to his knees. Carrie was lying on the floor of the cave, her tiny body seeming even smaller in the twilight. Her lips were almost purple, her breathing irregular, and her eyes closed. Beverly immediately approached, placing her hand on the girl's forehead, and feeling the intense heat of the fever that had consumed her for days. "She's alive, but we need to get her to the hospital right away," Beverly said with the authority of someone who had raised 5 children and helped take care of half the children in the area. "The dehydration is severe, and this fever can cause permanent damage if it is not treated quickly." Walter took his daughter in his arms, feeling how light she was, almost as if she were made of paper. Carrie mumbled something incomprehensible, her eyes opening for a few seconds before closing again. Throughout the journey back, the white horse accompanied them, limping visibly but refusing to stay behind. It was as if he knew his mission was not yet complete. In the small hospital in Harmony Creek, the doctor who examined Carrie confirmed everyone's fears. The girl was severely malnourished and dehydrated, with signs of hypothermia and a respiratory infection that could have been fatal if she had been found a few hours later. While she received IV fluids and medication, Walter remained by the bed, holding his daughter's cold little hand and whispering pleas for forgiveness that she could not hear. It was during the first night in the hospital that Beverly asked the question that Walter had feared since the moment of the rescue. "How was that horse loose in the woods, Walter? Carrie always said he would never leave the property on his own, and from the injuries he has, it seems like he's been through something terrible." The weight of guilt finally became unbearable for Walter. Between tears that he had held back for days, he confessed everything to Beverly: the gambling debts, the financial despair, the sale of the horse to the slaughterhouse, the lie he had told Carrie. Each word came out like a dagger in his own heart, but he knew he could no longer carry that secret alone. Beverly listened in silence, her face hardening with each revelation. When Walter finished speaking, she remained quiet for long minutes before responding. "You almost killed your own daughter for money," she said, her voice filled with a disappointment that hurt more than any scream. "That child lost her mother, and you still had the nerve to take away the only thing that made her smile." In the following days, while Carrie recovered slowly in the hospital, other truths began to come to light. Beverly, concerned about the girl's future, decided to investigate Walter's financial situation more deeply. What she discovered shocked her deeply. He had not only lost money in illegal gambling, but had also forged documents to obtain loans, using as collateral the small property that legally belonged to his deceased wife. The papers that Beverly found hidden in Walter's house revealed that Carrie's mother had inherited a farm from her own parents, a property that included not only the house where they lived, but also arable land and a small natural spring that had considerable value in the semi-arid region. Walter had never mentioned this to anyone, but the documents clearly showed that Carrie was the legitimate heir to everything. Even more shocking was the discovery that Walter had promised the property to multiple creditors, creating an impossible legal situation where the same collateral was being used to cover debts that totaled much more than the land was worth. It was a fraud that could result in imprisonment if discovered by the competent authorities. When Carrie finally woke up completely after 5 days in the hospital, her first word was snowball. Walter had arranged for the horse to be treated by a local veterinarian and was recovering in a borrowed pasture near the hospital. But Carrie's reaction when she learned that her father had sold her best friend was devastating for everyone who witnessed it. "You lied to me," she said in a small voice, but filled with hurt. "You said he had run away, but you gave him to bad people." Tears streamed down her face, still pale from recovery, and for the first time since waking up, she refused to look directly at her father. The situation became even more complicated when Walter's creditors discovered that he was in the hospital and came to collect their debts publicly. The arrival of 3 intimidating-looking men at the hospital caused an uproar that caught the attention of the entire small town. They demanded immediate payment or the transfer of the property, without caring about the fact that a 4-year-old child was recovering from a traumatic experience. It was Beverly who faced the men, showing them the documents that proved that the property had never legally belonged to Walter. "You were deceived by this man," she said firmly. "He had no right to offer this land as collateral because it belongs to his daughter, a minor. Any contract you made with him is invalid." The revelation caused a complete turnaround in the situation. The creditors, realizing that they had been victims of fraud, turned their anger against Walter with an intensity that terrified him. They demanded not only the money borrowed, but also compensation for the interest and the time lost. Walter, having no way to pay and now exposed as a fraudster, saw his situation deteriorate rapidly. Meanwhile, Carrie began to show clear signs that she no longer wanted to be near her father. She cringed whenever he approached and could only sleep when Beverly was around. The trauma of having been abandoned in the woods, coupled with the discovery that her father had lied about the horse, had created an emotional barrier that seemed insurmountable. Beverly made a decision that would change everything. She approached the town's social worker and explained the situation, requesting that Carrie be placed under her temporary guardianship while Walter's legal situation was resolved. "This child has suffered enough," she argued. "She needs stability and people she can trust." The request was accepted almost immediately, especially after the social worker saw Carrie's emotional state and heard the full account of the events. Walter found himself not only losing his daughter, but also facing possible criminal charges for document fraud. On the night that Carrie left the hospital to go live temporarily with Beverly, she made only one request. She wanted to see the white horse. The reunion between the two was emotional for everyone who witnessed it. Carrie ran to the animal with what little strength she had, and he lowered his head to receive her caresses, as if he also knew that they were finally safe together. 6 months had passed since Carrie had been found in the woods, and the transformation in her life was visible to anyone who knew her before the tragedy. The girl who once walked with her head down and spoke in whispers now ran around Beverly's yard with an energy that made the elderly woman's heart fill with joy. The genuine smile had returned to Carrie's face, especially when she was close to the white horse, who never left her side again. Beverly had officially become Carrie's legal guardian after a process that revealed even more irregularities in Walter's conduct. The investigation of the fraudulent documents led the authorities to discover a network of illegal loans that he had taken out, using not only his deceased wife's property, but also equipment from the workshop that had already been given as collateral to other creditors. The man who was once respected in the community was now seen as a desperate conman. The small farm that Carrie had inherited from her mother turned out to be much more valuable than anyone imagined. In addition to the fertile land, there was a pure water spring that had become even more precious due to the prolonged drought affecting the region. Beverly, with her experience in rural management, managed to organize a small business selling water to neighboring properties, ensuring that Carrie had enough resources to grow up with dignity. The white horse, who now went by the name of Angel, a nickname that Carrie had given him after the rescue, had completely recovered from his injuries. His coat had returned to its immaculate white of before, and he had become a constant presence in the girl's life. In the morning, she brushed him carefully while talking about her dreams from the night before. In the afternoon, they explored together the safe limits of the property, always under the watchful eye of Beverly. During the afternoons, Carrie liked to sit under the shade of a century-old oak tree, brushing Angel's mane while telling him about her classes at the local elementary school where she had begun to study. She learned to read and write with impressive ease, and her essays always talked about the importance of loyalty, honesty, and true love. Values she had learned through the painful but transformative experience she had lived through. Beverly watched these moments with a peaceful smile, knowing that she had made the right decision by opening her home and her heart to that special girl. At 70, she had found a new purpose in life, and Carrie's joy had rejuvenated her own spirit in a way that she had not experienced since her youth. On a December afternoon, when the heat heralded the arrival of another summer, Carrie was playing with Angel in the pasture when she spotted a ragged man walking down the dirt road that passed in front of the property. For a moment, her heart raced as she thought it might be her father returning, but when the man got close enough to be recognized, she saw that he was just a wanderer asking for help. Beverly offered the stranger a plate of food and a glass of fresh water from the spring. While he ate voraciously, he said that he came from a distant town and that along the way he had met a man who said he was from Harmony Creek. He was in a terrible situation, reported the wanderer. He said that he had lost everything because of gambling and that he couldn't even look at his own reflection in the mirror. He seemed like a man shattered by guilt. Carrie listened to the story without showing emotion, but that night, before sleeping, she whispered a prayer, asking that her father find peace somewhere far away. She had learned that forgiving did not mean forgetting, but rather freeing the heart from the weight of resentment. Years later, when Carrie became a young woman, she would always tell her children the story of how a white horse had saved her life, not only physically but emotionally, and she always ended the story with the same lesson that Beverly had taught her: that true love appears in the most difficult moments, and that loyalty is the most precious thing anyone can possess.